So I'm Pat Tully. I'm director of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this program is funded by a grant from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the American Library Association, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Constitution Center. And the name of the grant is Revisiting the Founding Era, and its purpose is to use historical documents to spark public conversations about the founding era's enduring ideas and themes and how they remain relevant today. So the Gilder Lehrman Institute has a premier collection of primary source documents from colonial and early federal periods, and they're digitizing all these documents to make them more widely available. So the documents include official documents like treaties and things, but also they have letters, they have diaries, they have maps, and they have woodcut illustrations. So the little handout that I was passing out has a link to that database, which is freely available to all if you're interested. We've also purchased, and you'll see many, many copies back there, copies of a booklet containing the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and those are yours to keep. So this is the first of at least 2 programs we're going to be doing as part of this grant. The second is going to be sometime in March, but we haven't nailed down all the details yet. So I am very pleased to now introduce Priscilla Schulte, who is the campus director here at UAS Ketchikan.
You've got a nice series of introductions, thank you.
Yes.
And I just want to thank people for coming out on this slippery, icy night. And I'm really excited to introduce 2 of our faculty, John Radzilowski, our history professor, Brandon Chapman, anthropology professor. And we have been, over the last few years, getting out more and more doing talks in the public of different interests. And I'm really excited to hear what you both have come up with tonight, so thank you.
I'm gonna, okay, go ahead, all right. I'm going first, John's going second. So usually, and Kathy, could you, yeah, thank you. So usually what we do with these Ask UASs, I think some of you have been to multiple of these before, is, we go hour and a half, 2 hours, however long our discussion, partakes, and usually it's faculty talking and then with some discussions at the end. Because, this is a library-funded sort of event, we wanted to make this a little bit different, where John and I will probably talk maybe about 10 or 15 minutes each, and we want to make this more of like a town hall style thing, where you all have questions for us. We make this more of a public discussion than just us presenting material. So we're just going to try to overview some major themes that we hope to discuss tonight, and then we can open it up to everybody and hopefully have a larger discussion about some of these things. So as an anthropologist, John's going to get into more of the sort of intricate history of the documents. We're going to try to focus on, there are a lot of, founding documents we could look at a ton. We're going to try to focus mostly on the 2 biggies, the Declaration and the Constitution, as the primary founding documents that structure our government, that give us hopefully our values, all of these other things. And so as an anthropologist, what I want to do is sort of give a just wider sort of global and historical context to our Constitution and Declaration compared to other founding documents in other countries. Because I have a research history in the political and economic development of other nation states, and so I thought that would be relevant to all of you. So we just put it in wider context, okay? So, if anybody knows this, of course, the famous photo here and carving here. This is actually on the one of the newest museums in Philadelphia, the Museum of the American Revolution. It just opened 2 years ago. Highly recommend it. Oftentimes when we think of sort of looking at founding documents, we think of looking at the founding just visiting somewhere for tourism purposes. We obviously think of like Washington, D.C. We should not overlook obviously Philadelphia. If anybody ever has a chance to go to the Museum of the American Revolution, it's really quite something. It was just opened 2 years ago. It's quite impressive. And a lot of these sort of things we're going to talk about tonight are sort of discussed in there. And anyway, this is the big carving outside that new museum there in Philly. So one of my photos. But anyway, so I'm going to talk just briefly. Oh, get my pointer going here. Get it on. There we go. Sorry about that. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the Declaration and then go into the Constitution a little bit more. So of course the Declaration, obviously just as a review, of course, was adopted in July of 1776. I think we all sort of know that as a baseline. In ways it is sort of a guarantor of equality in our system, right? And Abraham Lincoln, of course, made this argument, and I think John will detail this a little bit more. In a way, it kind of frames the Constitution. It gives us sort of a way to more fully contextualize what the Constitution means in a general sense. It established that our system is not based on majoritarian rule. This will be a theme, I think, that comes up as we continue through the evening, meaning that, it does set up the idea of a sort of equal application of law, okay? That goes along with the concept of equality. Historically, it has been a recruiter of various immigrants. Of course, we are a nation of immigrants in many senses over our multi-century history. And so the promise of equality, again, the equal application of laws, regardless of demographics or background, certainly that is what the Declaration, some of the main things that it sort of guarantees and outlines. We can look to other parts of the world. Simon Bolivar in Latin America was very much, through the 1800s, very much influenced by this, and a lot of the reasons why we have constitutions, declarations, and even nation states in Latin America is because of the influence of the Declaration on these sort of independence movements elsewhere in the world and even in our own hemisphere. So it does have a wide range of historical precedent here. The Constitution, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I study tribal peoples and other cultures in the world, and there is a large variety of constitutions in the world, as large as the diversity of the thousands of peoples in the world. Most nation states do have some sort of founding document or constitution. Many of them have been changed over the years, a lot more than ours has. Ours is one of the oldest and least amended or least changed or least revised constitution in the world. But we'll try to give you some context here. Almost all of the constitutions presently in the present day across the world, they do have some sort of balance of power outlined in them. Now, there are, of course, authoritarian states recently in the present day, of course, those places that we would consider semi-authoritarian or ruled by a dictator, even a despot, okay? Those obviously exist in the present day, like North Korea and other states, but all of them actually have a balance of power, a legislature, an executive, the different branches sort of things outlined explicitly in them. Many of them do. Many of them also have lists of many sort of individual rights within them as well. So it's those sort of things that we think are maybe unique to our Constitution, are actually, you find them in a very general sense. There are obviously many different specifics here, but in a general sense, they do exist in a lot of other constitutions. Most constitutions start with a preamble at the start that basically outlines sort of the history of the people and sometimes the culture of the people too. Now, this is a big difference between other world constitutions and our own, and we'll talk about this sort of as I end here in a few minutes. Our Constitution does not refer to any specific culture, right? It doesn't refer to any sort of specific ethnic group. This is a big difference between other constitutions. Other constitutions often do. They talk about, there's the Cambodian Constitution that talks about the history of their people and how they overcame oppression. And this, state that we are in now is the result of the fighting of the Cambodian people, that sort of thing. It talks specifically about an ethnic group and a history of that ethnic group. Ours does not, because of course we were founded ideally as an inter-ethnic, a multi-ethnic sort of society. So culture is something that is sort of uniquely missing, if you will, is not included in our Constitution. Other things, yet the language of power varies greatly across these constitutions. So even though there are in most constitutions balance of powers outlined and different branches of government outlined, there are still these exceptions given somewhere at the beginning or the middle of the documents, in that, well, we have a king that shall rule, regardless of whether we have a legislature or not. So they have the balance of power, it's explicit, but then, oh, well, wait, the Kim family is, actually in charge in North Korea, sort of thing. That's one of the first sentences in the preamble of the North Korean Constitution. The great Kim family, the great Kim Il-sung is the eternal leader of the North Korean people. That sort of thing. So it kind of brushes away the other things, the other ideals that are in those constitutions, if that makes sense. 50% of constitutions in the world survive no longer than 19 years. Ours has been around over 200, right? It gives you a little bit of comparison here. So there's a lot of turnover. There can be a lot of chaos in other nations about how long a constitution survives. when it gets overturned, when it gets amended severely, that sort of thing. So, basically, you got a coin flip's odds about whether, your Constitution is going to last a generation as far as when we look at other parts of the world. So that's a big thing to keep in mind, too. Ours is long-lasting. If you look at where other constitutions start historically of present-day nations, 1900s, all that sort of stuff with other parts of the world, ours, 1776, goes way, way back. So there are not too many. Some in Europe also go back quite far, but ours is certainly one of the oldest, if not the oldest. And there's a low percentage of constitutions, too, that have had executive term limits amended or replaced. People think, that, so we look at some of these other countries where there are, again, sort of dictators or, semi-dictators leading the nation, and we think that, well, okay, they have a constitution, but it's been, they just amend it. They make a person a president for life, or the person amends the Constitution. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Actually, what it is that people just get into power, and then the population either maybe passively accepts it, or just, it doesn't necessarily happen all the time by amending the Constitution. People can just get in power for various reasons, and because the people accept it and accept an authoritarian rule, they can stay in power. So it's not always about just explicitly amending or changing the Constitution in every case. Other thing, oh goodness, excuse me. Sorry about that. American exceptionalism is another big theme when you hear about the you hear about the founding documents, right? Are our founding documents exceptional? Are they unique in some way? Okay, so I just wanted to address that too, because that's kind of a big theme when this is talked about in public discourse and in political debates. So there are some things that are unique about our documents. Again, our Constitution is one of the oldest and least recently revised in the world. You look at, if you compare founding documents across the globe, you'll see multiple amendments, sometimes dozens within just the past few years, few decades. And so there's a lot of amending, a lot of changing of constitutions going on, while ours is quite difficult and doesn't get changed that often, right? There is no reference to culture, as I mentioned earlier, which, most other founding documents you'll find an explicit ethnic group or ethnic groups or some of that sort of history actually explicitly defined in the documents. Ours does not. Ours is also, there are arguments made about this, ours is unique too in the actual wording of our rights, for example. You look at other constitutions and what they will say is, okay, maybe a right to free, we think of our rights, free speech, right to free, non-judge, a fair trial, that sort of thing, a speedy trial. In most other constitutions, it's worded as the state gives you those rights, or the people have these rights. In our Constitution, it's oftentimes worded as the government cannot regulate or repress these rights, right? So that's a difference too. It's basically framing it in a negative sense, in that the government cannot take these natural rights away from you. Okay, so that's oftentimes an argument that's made about our founding documents, and that is genuinely unique among ours. Most other constitutions do not have that sort of wording. And it's also, ours is one of the most difficult to amend, right? It takes a, high percentage, supermajorities essentially, to across many different scales of government, and many entities are needed to be able to actually amend the Constitution. Okay, so you've got to get a lot of votes, and it's very difficult. Obviously, no one person can do it. It takes the legislature, it takes other things. So ours is certainly the most one of the most difficult to amend. The Japanese Constitution is probably one of the other ones that's quite difficult in that sense. So, and it also hasn't been amended very much either. So
It's based on the American
which
one,
makes
too.
it, yeah, it's based on the American one, right? So it makes sense. Don't want to go too long here. This is maybe a little bit hard to see, but this is just comparing some up to the present day and going back how long on the bars here in different nation states, how long different constitutions of different nations have existed. And then all these little marks are basically amendments, changes to those constitutions, okay? So you can see, like, this goes back to just before 1800 all the way up to the present day on this chart. And you see, we've got a lot of Europe there essentially on this one, and the USA is right down here, okay? And so if you look at that, it's sort of what we were talking about earlier. Obviously, ours is one of the oldest. It goes way back, before 1800, 1776. And then you see the lack of changes essentially, right? There are many European constitutions. I mean, the German Constitution has been amended. multiple times within the past decade, that sort of thing. So again, it just gives you sort of a larger comparative perspective on these sorts of things. So constitutions change pretty radically sometimes in different nations. Ours has stayed pretty much the same over that long period of time. Okay. You could look at other parts of the world. This is other parts of Europe. In of course many other parts of the world, some constitutions are very new, and in a little more places that are a little more chaotic, they're almost brand new, like Kyrgyzstan and places like that. But again, authoritarian, all flavors of countries have constitutions and founding documents. Authoritarian nations have constitutions. If you actually look at, this is a chart looking at authoritarian versus democratic regimes and how of the constitutions in the world at different points in time, most of the world's constitutions have been under actually authoritarian nations. So this is kind of a juxtaposition for us, well, how can a nation that is ruled by one person essentially, or one person that has full power, how does the Constitution exist in that system? How is it legitimate? Well, they exist, but sometimes they're not followed, or sometimes they have these exceptions given in the Constitution where, well, this family or this one person is the absolute ruler. There's this these one or two sentence sort of things that make it that way. I'll stop here. I was going to give some examples. I don't really have time. I want to give it over to John. I was going to show you the example of the Soviet Union, one of the, as far as political repression and lack of rights for the people, one of the worst examples in human history. They actually had a constitution, and sort of give some examples of that. But I'll sort of skip through that because I don't really have time. Maybe we can talk about that later. India was an example I was going to give sort of comparative. India is considered, sort of in some ways a modern democracy, right? So sort of comparable on the Asian side to us. Just as an example of just one of these, it was adopted relatively recently in 1950, so some of these world constitutions are relatively new, just within the past few generations. But it's one of these things that's incredibly long, incredibly lengthy constitution, and it's been amended often, and it's amended about every few years. There is a declaration, so it has, they have a declaration and constitution just like we do. And it is the longest constitution in the world. Compared to ours, I mean, think about this, 395 articles and 22 parts, and 8 what they call schedules, which are very broad sort of categories. And it's been amended 103 times since 1950, meaning, within basically 70 years. So a little bit more of an extreme example, but still, India is one of the world's largest quote-unquote democracies, right? So just wanted to give you some sort of context here when we look at other nations. Article 21 is a big one in that Constitution. It has a lot of different rights outlined, different human rights, including a speedy trial, to earn a livelihood, health, education, to water. That's actually outlined in the Constitution there, to have a right to water. Okay. And so now, whether these things are actually met in real life or not, of course, in India, that's not really the case, of course, because they have a big caste system, that sort of thing. So it is a thing to say too, that when you look comparatively, lots of rights are outlined, but do you have the means to implement them? What are the reasons why they're implemented? Because you can list them, but do they actually occur in real life? Well, certainly not always. Other things here. So just as a summary, some comparative lessons before I give it over to John. Just when looking again at sort of comparing different founding documents of the world, some of the things that I found, one of the most important factors is, I would say the most important factor, as far as hopefully we can agree that good outcomes are something along the lines of a democratic republic, where people have, in a way, self-governing power and are not under a dictatorship. That would obviously, I think we could all agree that would be a good outcome, generally, politically. And so one of the most important factors to get to that type of outcome is to make sure that the structure of government is outlined explicitly and in a certain way. That there's no over-concentration of power in one entity, okay? And if there is not a balance in your constitution, in your founding document, it's going to lead to problems eventually. So that's one of the things we have, our balance of powers. That's a big thing that, again, not every single nation has, and certainly we don't have any exception statements about, this person shall rule over all else, obviously. It's also crucial how a leader is selected, the mechanisms We have our mechanisms in our, outlined for electing our leaders, right? Our legislators, our president, okay? So it's crucial how a leader is selected to, and that is explicitly outlined in clear language as well. The number of rights, or even if rights are written down or codified, matters, I would argue matters a little bit less, because you look at other, all these other nations, and they, sometimes have laundry lists of all these rights that are given, but do they actually achieve those or even come close to achieving them? They don't necessarily. One of my favorite cases is Niger, small African country next to Nigeria. They have these very liberal, small L, liberal, open, worded sort of things about, everybody will have free access to education and healthcare and all these sorts of things, and yet they are out of the hundreds of nations the last on indicators about actually providing that to their people. Okay, so you can list them, but do you have the means to actually put it through policy, that sort of thing? So is it necessarily important to list these things in a constitution? Maybe not necessarily, okay? That comes more to policy. So you must have the means to implement. If you're going to put economic rights, economic goods as rights, it's more practical to do that through policy. Do you have to list it in the Constitution or amend the Constitution to say free right to health care, that sort of thing? Maybe it's not that important to do that, okay? That makes sense. So with that, I think I've taken maybe my time or more than my time. John's going to give us some more particular to American history, historical perspective on things. So.
Well, thank you, Brandon. Good, and it actually sets me up pretty well, I think, for what I was going to say. But I wanted to start out with a question. That question is, since we're just talking about rights, where do rights come from? Anyone has an opinion about this?
Bill of Rights.
What's that?
Bill of Rights.
Did they come from the Bill of Rights? They come from the Bill of Rights. How many think they come from the Bill of Rights? Come on, it's okay.
Start.
They come from the Bill of Rights. Okay. No, they don't come from the Bill of Rights. Where do they come from? That is incorrect. You'd still get a grade for that.
Magna Carta.
No, not Magna Carta. Where do rights derive? What do I say? Derive from? They derive from. Yes.
They come from God.
They come from God. Okay, and that's actually the correct or partly correct answer, because that's what it says. The rights are inherent to you, and this is when you read. This is why you read the Declaration of Independence with the Constitution, because the Declaration of Independence says basically we are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, that's important because the rights, and when Brandon was talking about negative and positive rights, and I won't go too heavy into the philosophy on that one, but essentially negative rights are things that can't be taken. So basically, if you get rid of the Bill of Rights, you get rid of the Constitution, you get rid of the Declaration of Independence, and you would still have rights, because the rights are inherent to you. Whether you decide they come from God or whether you decide they come from nature. And Thomas Jefferson mentions both in here. There's nature and nature's God, and he kind of parses that a little bit. So you don't have to believe in God to have the rights, but they come from outside of you. You have them regardless of who you are and regardless of what anyone says. Okay, so the purpose of the Constitution then, unlike, say, the French Constitution or some of the other constitutions that we see in the world, is to secure the rights, to guarantee the rights, not to grant the rights. Okay, that's a crucial difference. That's one of the things when we talk about negative and positive. There's a really nice essay by Sir Isaiah Berlin on this topic. A negative right is something that someone cannot do to you, in other words, so they can't take something away from you. And negative sounds like it's bad, it's negative. Positive right is the right to realize some greater good in the future or in the present. Okay, so that would be more like the right to free health care would be considered a positive right. Okay, and that doesn't mean positive is good and negative is bad. Those are just the way that scholars have laid that out. But that kind of is crucial, because that's one of the things that when we look at, as one of the things that people have forgotten, is we have the Constitution, and I think one of the unique things about Americans is that we actually pay attention to our Constitution much more in some cases than other countries, and we debate it much more. It's been a subject of debate among the populace, and people talk about their constitutional rights, discuss them, and argue about them, which is probably a good thing, even if we don't always agree on what they are, what they mean. But it's one of the things that it's why the Constitution in and of itself has to be understood in the context of the other documents, in particular the Declaration of Independence. Because if you think about the, and this was something that has come up repeatedly throughout American history, but certainly during the era of the Civil War, when there was debate over slavery. And one of the things that both the abolitionists who wanted to get rid of slavery and the pro-slavery side said was that the Constitution does not outlaw slavery. We may restrict it. There is debate over how we're going to restrict slavery. But in fact, William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the most famous abolitionists, actually got up on stage during a rally before the Civil War. He burned a copy of the Constitution. He said the Constitution allows slavery, we got to get rid of it, we got to change it, we got to start all over again. Abraham Lincoln comes along and says, no, the Constitution can permit us to outlaw slavery. And people would say, well, Lincoln, where is it? I mean, he doesn't say that in the Constitution. He said, you're looking in the wrong place, you need to look at the Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration of Independence, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Lincoln cites the Declaration to Lincoln, and for a lot of people who have followed Lincoln, the Declaration is like the key that unlocks the Constitution. Or if you want to use a more spiritual metaphor, it's like the soul that inhabits the body of the Constitution. Okay, so it's something that you can't necessarily understand one without the other, and it's one of the key things. Now that phrase, and this is a very interesting phrase, that in Thomas Jefferson mostly wrote the Declaration. He had some editing help from a couple other people, including John Adams. But it's a lot of it, and they took out some big parts of it, but they left a lot of the prose as Jefferson's. And that's this whole notion of rights begins with these three, that is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And life is the number one, because without life, if the government or some other power can take your life, you cannot exercise any other rights. And so this is the first of the rights, the primary one. Liberty is the right to act politically, to be active, to be able to select your government. And so it isn't just I get to do whatever I want. It's very specific. Jefferson had something very specific in mind. But it's the third one that we kind of trips us up, and that's the pursuit of happiness. And to us, happiness is a feeling. So I feel happy today. Well, I've successfully fulfilled Jefferson's point here. But no, that's not what Jefferson meant. It isn't like, I've got myself a new boat, I got a nice house, that's happiness. It isn't, we think of that as sort of a feeling or an individual kind of thing, but with Jefferson, he had something, this phrase that he uses is very particular, and the founders, as I'll try to lay out, were educated in a particular way, particularly in the classics, the Greek philosophy, the Roman histories. Obviously, the King James Bible was a major source as well. Then the Enlightenment philosophers, Locke, Montesquieu. But this phrase that Jefferson uses is very specific, and everyone who read that would have understood immediately at that time what that meant. And this is a term that comes from Aristotle. And he uses a Greek term called the eudaimonia, which means doesn't quite mean happiness as a feeling or as a pleasure. And Aristotle would have separated physical pleasures like good food, sex, nice clothes, all these things. All these pleasures are separate from happiness. Pleasures can lead to happiness, or they can lead to unhappiness, according to Aristotle. But that's not what happiness is. So the pursuit of happiness, according to Aristotle, and it's what Jefferson picks up on, is really about the pursuit of doing good, of virtue. So happiness is this idea, this pursuit of happiness is the pursuit of doing good things, of doing virtuous things, and so it's not just an individual, I'm going to go make myself happy, but to actually improve yourself, to improve the world around you, the right to be good and excellent whether it's in your profession, in your personal life. These are the things that Jefferson was trying to get at. And so if you think of it as a structure, you've got life, and you need that to get started. And then liberty is the right to act in the public realm, but then that action has a point, and that point is the pursuit of happiness. Okay, and that's actually the pursuit of virtue. And this idea of virtue is one thing, it's not written into the Constitution at all. The assumption was that people understood what virtue was at the time. And the founders all came from the same background. They had not all exactly the same, similar education, but a very similar, they read a lot of the same books, let's put it that way. Okay, so they had a pretty clear idea of what virtue was, and it was something that they thought about a lot, and they wrote about it a lot. As you read some of the other documents that are on the website, you can find quite a few examples of this. And I'll read a couple, kind of illustrate this. And this is a letter from a soldier in the Revolutionary War, and he's writing to his father. And this is a sort of personal letter. It wasn't meant to go public, but he's a soldier. He's actually a lieutenant in Washington's army. He learns his father is very ill and possibly near to death. His father's a Tory. His father opposes the revolution, so they're on opposite sides. And so he writes to his father, and he says, "When I look back on our past time, I regret the difference of sentiment in great and sometimes little politics. It was dedication from the happiness otherwise to have been enjoyed. It was a deduction from the happiness otherwise to have been enjoyed. Yet you always had too much regard to freedom of thinking and rights and conscience to lay upon me any injunctions which could interfere with my own opinion, which was my duty. In all things I have endeavored to keep a good conscience, void of offense toward God and man. Often I have thanked my Maker for the greatest blessing of my life," and he underlines this part, "your example and instructions in all the duties I owe to God and my neighbor. They have not been lost on me, and though I am aware in many things I have offended and come short of my duty, for these things I am grieved, but not as those who have no hope." So this was something, again, personal letter. I mean, nowadays when I write to my parents, write to my mom, I'm like, I don't write like this. Okay, so this was something that people thought about very deeply, and they tried to practice it in everyday life. And this was what they considered to be that was the example of the pursuit of happiness. The idea that you would address your father, that you would think about your father, even though you disagreed with him fundamentally on the most important issue of the day. Here's another example, which is George Washington. This is a public letter that he wrote at the time of the Constitutional Convention. He doesn't really hold office yet, but he's writing to some of the different governors, in this case the governor of New Jersey, and he says that the citizens of America, placed in the most enviable condition, are from this period to be considered actors on the most conspicuous theater. And this seems to be designed particularly by Providence for the display of human greatness and felicity. Here they are not only surrounded with everything that can contribute to the completion of private and domestic enjoyment, but heaven has crowned in all its other blessings by giving fairer opportunity for political happiness than any other nation has been favored with. So Washington's a very good example of some of these virtues. Is essentially saying that this is something we have this opportunity, and they were very conscious in this idea of greatness, of pursuing happiness is really to end up with greatness. Okay, and so this was the point of freedom. Okay, the point of freedom was not just to, hey, I'm just going to go and do whatever I want. I want to not go to work today. I want to have a drink, get a nice TV, whatever. The freedom was the freedom to pursue greatness, to pursue something higher than yourself. And this was the purpose, what they saw of these documents. Now, their concept of some of this would have been a little different than ours, of course. So we tend to be much more individualistic. They were individualistic also, but not quite to the same degree. But they also, in pursuing those, there was particular people. When you see the structure of the Constitution, one of the reasons why it's not necessarily majoritarian rule, why they have a republic, is because they were concerned that not everyone was going to meet up with those standards. And this is one reason why they don't have a pure majority rule, because by the way they saw it, people needed time and training, and in order to be able to realize these rights and sort of achieve, you had to achieve a certain standard before you could actually avail yourself of these rights. Okay, so it wasn't just that you had them, but your exercise of them really depended on you responding to that in a certain way, in a certain very particular way. And so they would not necessarily. This is one reason why initially they're not always clear on who gets to vote. For example, is it only people who own property? Is it only English-speaking people? Is it only whites? Is it only men? All these things gradually went away, but they were very much a feature of the early Constitution because not necessarily they not necessarily favorable to any of those groups, but they saw it as these are groups that needed to be sort of drawn and they need to be educated, and that may take years, maybe never. But it's one of the reasons why Lincoln is able to look to the Constitution and say, yes, these rights exist for everyone, regardless of whether they can exercise them at present or not. And that's why we can get rid of slavery. So that reading of the Constitution makes it applicable to a much larger body of people. Now, a lot of the interpretations of some of the acts have changed over the years. When the Constitution is written, it's very specific in its wording, and it's. For example, when they say Congress, this is one of the articles of the Bill of Rights. The first. Let's see if I can read it here. Is. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And this is very specific. This is written very specifically, and it's one of the ones that we tend to argue over a lot. And it's very specific to Congress. They don't say the states are restricted, because quite a few, when the Constitution was written, quite a few states had established churches. Massachusetts, for example, had a state church until 1832. It's a congregational church. But it restricts Congress from doing that. It does not restrict the states. So the First Amendment, if you were going to be a strict constitutionalist, I'm laughing at Larry. If you're going to be a strict constitutionalist, the First Amendment would not prevent, for example, the state of Utah from establishing the LDS Church as the state church of Utah. However, other amendments like the 14th Amendment would probably prevent that. But strictly speaking, and it was a particular response. And again, when you see the Constitution, and that's why understanding in context sort of brings some of these out. At the time, in Europe, the states, the governments controlled the churches. So you had the Church of England. You had to belong to the Church of England if you were a loyal subject of the king or the queen. And if you did not attend the services of the Church of England, you could actually be fined or arrested, because if you weren't a part of the Queen's church, it's possible that maybe you're not that loyal to the Queen, and that's called you're a traitor, and it could be a sticky end for you. And so it was not to protect the government from the church, but to protect the church from the government. And now that meaning changed in the course of the 19th century. As is often the case with the Constitution, the meanings of the words change, and it changes in part in response to widespread immigration, and particularly Irish immigration. So you have lots of Irish Catholic immigrants start showing up, and the question is, are they loyal to the government or are they loyal to the Pope? And so, well, we have to change. We have to make sure that that those Irish Catholics, what they learn, if they're able to, if we let them vote, well, they could elect someone who's loyal to the Pope. And there was big concern over this. They could take control of the public schools. They could do all kinds of things. So we have to protect ourselves from this threat, from this outside threat. And so the meaning of that clause actually changes in response to the perceived threat. And again, there's a number. I mean, the Second Amendment, for example, is actually one that is retained, at least in the courts, it's most of its original interpretation. But the First Amendment, which has a lot more rights, and it has altered itself, or continues to alter itself, continues to be a subject of a lot more debate. So even though we don't amend the Constitution very often, we actually do change its meaning and how we understand it, perhaps more than we might like to admit. And I'll just finish up by saying that these documents, and they, again, as Brandon pointed out, a lot of places have these, but in particular, the Declaration is something I think that is much overlooked. And it's important not only to talk about the international impact of the Declaration, and Brandon mentioned it bringing immigrants, but it also is one of the things that people outside the United States find most attractive about the United States. When people think about the United, when during the Cold War, I had a colleague of mine works for the Institute of World Politics, and the head of the Institute of World Politics is President Reagan, one of President Reagan's former national security advisors, and Professor Dr. Lenchowski said that during his time in the White House and during his time in national security, the number one recruiter, and this is during the Cold War, the number one recruiter for the United States behind the Iron Curtain was Thomas Jefferson. He recruited more people to help the United States clandestinely than any spy agency, any CIA, any those ideals that Jefferson laid out, which are the things that motivate the Constitution, that in a sense give us the who we are, that are the most important. So with that, open it up for questions. We have a few questions of our own that we can ask you as well if you want to.
And we're professors, so we went way over time.
But if you guys have
a little more than
questions.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Yes, sir.
John, you spoke of a specific thing being written in the Constitution.
Yes.
And then you spoke of changing in how these are interpreted over time. Could you address the judicial philosophy of strict constructionism, its effect on the history of the United States, and perhaps in the Supreme Court in recent decades?
Yeah, well, when we talk about, I think the people who are, well, there are two different judicial philosophies, broadly speaking. One is the so-called living constitution, the other is what's called originalism. And strict constructionism is maybe on the far end of original. Now, that most judicial thinkers, most judges fall somewhere in between these two. Most of them are not one or the other. A strict constructionist, and probably I'm trying to think, even Justice Thomas is not really a strict constructionist. But strict constructionist would be someone who would look back at try to understand the original meaning of the Constitution and try to apply that in the present as best they could. Now, it's problematic, as you know, because the meanings of the words have changed. The context we live in has changed. We have institutions now that we did not, like political parties, that we did not have when the Constitution was written, and we're not envisioned in the Constitution. So it's problematical. The opposite end, the living Constitution, when taken to its extreme, would say that, well, the Constitution means whatever we say it is, and that's equally problematic. And so I think most people fall in between one or the other. Now, when people say judicial activism, we have to understand the Constitution is a political document. It's subject to political debate, that's its purpose. And the courts are just as political. We elect judges. There's nothing more can't be more political than that. And so these battles are going to go on. I think when people use the term judicial activism, because when someone decides something the way I think it should be decided, that's wisdom. That's when someone decides it the way I don't like it, that's judicial activism. That's bad. So I think we have to be careful of that. I don't think there's been a move back toward sort of swing back toward the more originalist, but it's not that far. So I don't think we're under threat from going back to the original Constitution. I don't think we could. But you may have a different take on that.
I believe that modern strict constructionism is a way of suppressing rights of our citizens.
Could be construed that way. But it's also could be construed the other way, that going the living Constitution means that whoever is in charge gets to decide the meaning of the Constitution. And that's not favorable to the little guy.
I would posit that there are very much fewer people advocating living constitutions in position of power than those advocating strict construction.
I can't speak to that. I don't know the polling data on that.
Some examples of some of the things that we argue about and have been interpreted different ways from actual text in the Constitution, just from our first two amendments. The freedom of speech, right? What is the exact language? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech. What is the freedom of speech? Well, an originalist would look back and say, well, what did a reasonable person back at the time of the founding think freedom of speech was? A more living constitutionalist would say, well, what does freedom of speech mean more in the present day with the various behaviors and contexts that we have today? These things can be interpreted different ways. Arms, the right to bear arms. What is an arm, right? Not bear arms. I always remember that Family Guy joke where they put the bear arms up on the wall and said, this is our right to bear arms. So what is an arm? That changes. We have more capacity than ever to cause harm with various quote-unquote arms. That's only going to get worse. But is that something that should be? Should the interpretation of that change? Should it possibly be amended? Should it not? Those are obviously the big debates. Some of the big debates that we have, right? So.
Yeah, and one of with the Second Amendment, and that one actually has roots that go way back, and that's, like I say, one that has retained, at least the recent court cases, has retained a lot of its original meaning. There's a debate over, does it mean militia, does it mean individuals? In most ancient, early modern societies, the right to carry weapons, and by weapons I don't just mean a knife to cut your bread, but I mean offensive weapons, swords, axes, things you could actually kill people with, correlates to political rights. Peasants did not have the right to carry weapons. They did not have the right to act politically. If you were a knight, you had the right. If you were a samurai in Japan, samurai had the right to act politically, to carry weapons, to commit acts of violence. Commoners did not. Okay, and so, and if you don't want to go to Elizabethan England, Catholics, for example, could not carry arms. They could not own and possess weapons particularly during Queen Elizabeth's time, because they were considered a disloyal element. And so that being enfranchised and carrying arms has this sort of deep resonance. And so when the founders write this amendment, this is what they're looking back to. And it's something that goes back in many different societies. This idea that, those people who had that right also had the right to defend themselves, and they were meant to defend other classes in society. And this is why dueling is important in early modern societies. We have many of our founders, a number of our founders actually fight duels, including Hamilton and Burr. And it's because someone of equal standing offends you, you have the right to defend yourself with force in most of these societies. If someone of a lesser standing insults you, you can have your servants beat them up, but you don't fight a duel with them. Okay, so it's a very different mindset than what we're used to. Where this is something that the founders pick up on. And it's actually something in the English Bill of Rights as well. The English Bill of Rights is the sort of model for this. Things like not quartering soldiers in your home. This is one of the reasons why they're so offended by what the British do. One of the reasons is because they feel that they're violating their rights, not as Americans, but as British citizens. And that's why they are getting up in arms against the King of England.
John mentions from some other international examples these subgroups that can be mentioned in some other founding documents, right? Workers, peasants, samurais, I guess, from the Japanese example, right? This is something, you see this in other constitutions, is these sort of rights for subgroups laid out. And sort of this groups within the population explicitly reference to. And this is something that we really don't have in our founding documents. And this gets back to the larger concept of equality that, again, we've already come from the Declaration as well. That's really unique about our documents too, is that we don't make those references to subgroups. I would say that's ends up being one of the big problems of a lot of other documents, a lot of other not well-functioning nations, is that once you explicitly start outlining all these different groups, it opens the door to sort of a slippery slope. Well, we can put some groups over others, we can give rights to certain groups but not others. Once you start explicitly doing that within the documentation, it can potentially cause problems. So.
And there was a whole debate when the Constitution was being drafted over slavery, and should we mention slavery? And fortunately, except for a very oblique reference in the so-called three-fifths clause, slavery was left out, which leaves the question open to political action. And this is why Lincoln is able to say, yes, the Constitution can permit this, can permit us to get rid of slavery. Other people vehemently disagreed, of course, but other questions?
I have a question. This has been bothering me for 40-plus years. You're supposed to have had two languages in this country, English and German, or English and Hessian. And the Continental Congress is supposed to have had an election. The election was to go to English for a national language. And what I've heard for making for you to vote, as in the senator program to vote, is that English was selected through the Congress by one vote. Anything on this?
I have never heard of that. I have not heard that that was a debate. Now, I would say, okay, now, depending on which, you may be thinking of a state constitution, because there were, in Pennsylvania, I could see that happening. But that was not in the Constitution. I've never seen a reference to that part of the Constitution. There were quite a number of states, and I'm thinking now of my own home state of Minnesota, where they did print the Constitution in several different languages, and they were considered official languages. And so in Minnesota, it was English, of course, French, actually two of the native languages, Dakota and Ojibwe, and then I think German was the third one, or the last one. And so there were a number of states that toyed with the idea of having an official language other than English, or a second official language. Now that ended up being a dead letter in most states because English came to dominate. But I've never heard that in the national constitution. And it would have torpedoed the Constitution, quite frankly, because only 2 or 3 states had a big German population. And Benjamin Franklin, by the way, would have vetoed that right out, because Franklin writes a pamphlet actually several years before the denouncing German immigration as a threat to Pennsylvania. They say these people are these aliens are coming in, and pretty soon we're all going to be speaking German, and basically, and he also says the Germans aren't really even white people. They're really swarthy people. I read this from my immigration, blows people's minds. And so Franklin was, being a Pennsylvanian, but a Philadelphian, had an intense dislike of Germans. And I think Franklin would have walked out the door of the Constitutional Convention.
John can tell you a lot more about this because he teaches about it. I've taught courses on it too. But I mean, you look back at our history and going back to this time and up, I mean, it started as basically British, and then everything else was, the out group. And what gets defined as the out group or the other is changes drastically over time. It changes eventually too. In some parts of the country, even Northern Europeans, and of course in the early 20th, late 19th, early 20th century, the Southern Europeans, as Ellis Island continues to increase, and then of course we have other groups today that are more defined in some of our public discourse and debates as such. So that changes greatly over time. There's a huge spectrum.
And that's one of the advantages of not specifying groups within, because it does make it more open to people coming in. And that was the intent. I mean, the early colonies were fairly diverse in the sense that you had a lot of people spoke English, but you had Scots, you had Irish, and according to some people, they might not have spoken English, but then you had lots of Germans, you had Africans. One of the largest groups were enslaved Africans coming to the United States. You had Swedes, you had Finns, you had a whole bunch of different groups. So you had a lot of different groups. A lot of them did speak English, but they weren't necessarily like the Scots-Irish in particular were not considered a favored group. They were pushed back, and in fact, that's one of the when Andrew Jackson becomes president. He's one of the first Scots-Irish president. There's great concern over this because it's believed that the Scots people were not able to hold their temper very well, and Jackson was a particular problem with this. That this is one of the things that when you see the founders and particularly people like Washington, this idea of personal restraint and calmness and not overreacting, and Jackson is like he's ready to go a few rounds with you. So that was considered a real risk to elect him president.
Well, and even up into the 20th century, Catholicism,
Yeah.
was a big thing even back in the mid 20, just not too long ago, just a few generations ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Mitt Romney, Mormon,
Yeah.
there are still
remember when
prejudice
Kennedy
against that
was
today in
running.
some parts.
There was a lot of discussion about his Catholicism and being, accountable to the Pope, and it was common.
And that didn't that took a long that was as Arthur Schlesinger put it, the most enduring prejudice. So that was something that came over from England. But it was also one of the reasons why, and people thought we want to talk about, what could be changed. Well, one of the things that was changed back in the 1920s was not by the Constitution but by law, was the size of the House of Representatives. They were concerned that there were too many of the wrong sorts of people coming in and voting. And so the idea was that we were going to restrict the House of Representatives to 435 members. That's not specified in the Constitution. It doesn't say how many members we have to have. So in theory, it's supposed to expand with the population. So we have maybe up to 1,000 representatives now, which would be interesting because it would be very different. You'd probably have more other parties that would have a chance. We might have someone other than Don Young, for example. We'd have maybe 2 or 3 people elected instead. So we'd have Don, and we'd have like maybe 1 or 2 others. So that's a change. So you can actually change the structure of the country by not amending the Constitution, and that would be one example.
And we think about, amending, and we talk about language and the interpretation of that. I mean, imagine trying to rewrite the Constitution today with, all the different interpretations that we've had over the years. Obviously be a little less antiquarian in its nature, but it would be quite difficult, I imagine. It's the old joke, if you got how could you even get a constitutional convention together today? And if you could, would it even function? Certainly probably not as, too far out to say that it wouldn't function as well as the one that was originally back then. So.
As far as constitutional conventions go, was there never a consideration of a follow-up? Did not Jefferson recommend having constitutional conventions periodically?
Yes. Well, Jefferson was quite. Of course, he wasn't there. He was off in France. He was ambassador to France, and was deeply unhappy with the results. He campaigned against the Constitution and never voted for it. He was diehard. He eventually came to accept it. He became president, of course. But in particular, but his opposition was and the opposition that he sparked was what added the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was not in the original Constitution. That was added as a response to the criticism that, because when Madison wrote the Constitution, his idea, he thought that the rights were already enumerated at the state level, and so they didn't need to be enumerated at the federal level. And Jefferson's like, no, you're just creating this whole new structure, much more powerful presidency than anyone had envisioned, and so we need to guarantee them at the federal level as well. This was the Federalist versus the Anti-Federalist But Jefferson was much more open to that, yes, than a lot of the other founders. A lot of the founders were like, we're done. It was a grueling, process. It was not an easy process. We think of the founders as they're sitting around the white wigs and talking in highfalutin language, but in fact they were fighting it out, and they could be pretty nasty to each other, and just as nasty as politicians are today.
Go to Philadelphia and see all the houses, the boarding houses they were staying in for
Yeah.
the whole summers there for months and months on end. Fighting this out, going to negotiation.
Going to the
Serious
tavern, going to the
negotiation,
tavern
yeah.
afterwards, yeah. Well, another thing too that I think we often forget about is, and we talk, especially look at other countries and our recent experiences in, trying to import democracy to other countries is a good lesson in this, in that you can have elections, you can have constitutions, but it requires a culture of democracy. It requires a culture of civil society. You can't just say, okay, we're going to have elections and boom, everything's going to be great. A lot of early elections in American history, I mean, this was not an easy process. We happen to be, I look at the Constitution. Poland had one of the earliest constitutions. It was actually the second officially written constitution right after the United States, and that was 1791. But Poland has been between Russia and Germany, and so that constitution really never got off the ground because of that. We are next to Mexico and Canada, which is much nicer, and we didn't get invaded regularly. So we had these time to work things out amongst ourselves without the threat of too much foreign invasion. And so, a lot of the early elections in American history, you go to the polls and you'd have a riot. People fought at the polls, and that guy is on the other party. He's counting the ballots. Let's punch him in the face. A lot of the norms that we take for granted today came about very slowly and very difficult. If you disagreed with someone, you got a bunch of your friends together and you went and punched them in the face.
And if you think the language is bad today, it's not even close to what it was back then.
There's actually a little
The campaign,
Yeah, there's actually a little. It's meant as a joke on YouTube, but it's taking some of the language from the election of 1800 between Jefferson and Adams and creating modern attack ads based on it. It's hilarious. That Adams was trying to import mistresses from England and he was going to become the king of England, and Adams, they went after Jefferson's support of the French Revolution and said, you vote for Jefferson and you'll be, you want to see your children riding on a pike, and the ground covered with blood, then vote for Jefferson. This is, really just kind of nasty stuff. People didn't like the editorial in the newspaper, and you'd go burn down the newspaper office. That was pretty common. Or tar and feather the newspaper editor. This is where freedom of the press comes in, right? I mean, this was very real, and so over time we developed the ability to sort of live together peaceably, for the most part, with some exceptions. We had the Civil War, and that takes a long time, and it's not an easy process. Yes, sir.
I just, again, want to say thanks for having this discussion. It's just great to hear these things. I haven't thought about some of these things since high school. But one of the reasons why we wanted to come to this is this whole debate about republic and democracy. And just wondering what comments you may have. When I hear you read what the Founding Fathers did, it sounds like they had more republic in mind. I'm not sure if that's the proper interpretation. And it seems that there's a lot of trouble with pure democracy. So what was the intentions of our Founding Fathers?
Well, obviously, we're not a direct democracy. I mean, we have things like referendums in states that probably get the closest to that, where basically the closest to majoritarian rule, essentially, where if you get above 50% on something, then that becomes a statute, becomes law, that sort of thing. That's at the state level. So, again, it was certainly part of the founders, part of both documents, not to establish a sort of majoritarian rule based on direct democracy. Now we have, I mean, compared to most any other constitution in the world, I mean, our balance of power and all of the levies and polls that are in it to try to balance every branch of government and the checks and balances there are quite complex. And so, I mean, that was certainly one of the biggest things, and that speaks to a more Republican sort of stance on things. So I would say it's reasonable to say that the republicanism, obviously small r here, is the emphasis maybe over democracy. But I don't know what John has to say
Absolutely,
about
and
that.
that's I just back up what Brandon said. Madison, I say most of the Federalists, Madison, Hamilton, most of the Federalists were deeply suspicious of democracy. Because in most cases, democracy, we have this sort of, it's nice, it's rosy. Back then, democracy meant mob rule. It meant mobs going through the streets. This was what, often, in fact, this happened several times during the colonial period when they didn't like British governors. The mob would get together and they'd go throw the governor in the harbor, or something like this. That was their concept, is sort of unleashing people's passions. They look back to the Greeks, the failure of some of especially the Athenian democracy, and they said, no, we don't want that. Because a demagogue can get up and sway the people, and we want to prevent a demagogue or a dictator from coming along and swaying the people. This is why they put the Senate in as well, to keep the House of Representatives was meant to be the people's house. That was going to be the majority. The masses. The Senate was supposed to put a check on that. That's why the Senate is meant to slow things down, and
And it's a set number.
It is a set number of people, and based on the states. And originally, it was state legislatures that selected senators, so they weren't even directly elected. That's a later 20th century reform, and so the power was much more power was concentrated in the states. They were, yes, they meant to set up a republic. It meant to have democratic mechanisms in terms of elections, but it was not meant to be a straight up democracy. They did not feel that was going to work either then or in the future.
Even go to the primary system. It was not too long ago that the parties chose their candidates who was going to be put forth for the larger executive presidential election, right? This is actually a fairly new invention since the 60s, 70s, right? So yeah, it's certainly I mean, the way to put it is that we decide the deciders, right? We vote for the people that are going to make the decisions for us, essentially. That's what representative Republican democracy is about, so. But we do have little direct democracy things
We
in
do,
there too.
And this is a constant tension that we have. The referendum process at the state level, like Brandon said, is a good example of that. Especially when people feel that the system hasn't been working for them. In California, the one that kind of got the ball rolling, and that in California was kind of the leader on that, was property taxes. The property taxes were too high. They needed property tax relief. They ended up getting a referendum together to try to lower the property taxes, and that then opened the door. Then other referendum have come, thick and fast, and it's a way to try to bypass the legislature if the legislature doesn't seem to be working. But we have to also understand that when Madison set up some of and we think things aren't working in Washington. People have been saying that for about 200 years now. But Madison set it up that way on purpose. Better for things not to go slowly or not to work than for bad laws to be passed. I think that would have been the way that he would have seen that. He'd rather have a divided government that doesn't do anything rather than a government that takes away people's rights or represses their rights.
And we did emphasize the republicanism, I think, in our system. And again, I think that's for a reason, because the balancing of power and the structure of government really is one of the key factors. It's something that, again, you look at other states that don't function so well or are actually authoritarian. They have their list of rights. They have all these other things, but the one thing they really don't have is this sort of unique structuring of power explicitly laid out and not compromised like we do. And that speaks to again, that sort of small r republicanism sort of idea, if that makes sense. we have questions for you. I don't know if people want to stick around, but.
Shoot at it.
You had a list there.
I did. Well, I thought it would be, I don't know how, people want to stay or not. I did have a list. My PowerPoint's down now, but I could get it back up. Do you want me to, you want to do that?
Well,
Okay. We could ask.
They look like they're ready to learn here.
Same price.
Do you want to,
How you guys
can you do
doing?
that, Kathy? Thank you.
Yeah, from,
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
She's okay.
Let me get, there we go. What do you see as important values that are in our founding documents? We all, in our political debates, we always talk about, I think a lot of it comes down to values, right? What will we see as key values out of the Declaration of the Constitution? What's important to you? What do you see as overarching? That's a big question, I guess. A little too big for a passing Thursday evening.
Speech.
Freedom of speech?
Freedom of speech,
Governed by the rule of law.
rule of law.
Rule of law. Yeah. This goes back to equality, right?
Protection of your papers and properties.
Right to unreasonable search and seizure, yes.
Yeah.
Trial by jury.
And this is interesting too. The protection of property is not something that's explicit in a lot of other constitutions. There's right to fair trial, but not necessarily the protection of protection from seizure of property.
Yeah, and that was something that happened in a lot of, like in England, for example, if you went against the king or the queen, and you ran away, they would seize your, it's called a attainder, they would seize your property. And in fact, there was just a court case, just decided by the Supreme Court, on this, that went back to that amendment, which is the, what's the police, where they can
Asset
seize your,
forfeiture.
right, asset
Asset
forfeiture.
forfeiture, right.
And that was the basis, actually, that they decided against asset forfeiture.
So what does the rule of law include? Let's say that I live in, I think you mentioned Minnesota, and I worked hard all my life. Maybe I worked over in Michigan and went back and forth and bought a home, had a nice community, police protection, good schools. And all of a sudden, somebody in Washington decides that, be a mob rule, however, that we're going to open our borders. And we're going to allow anybody to come in and give them all the same rights that we have. They get to have Social Security, and they get to have free education, and free medical, and a lot of things that even I don't have. But all of a sudden, somebody has taken something from me. All of a sudden, my neighborhood has been infiltrated by people with lower IQs, with different, used to a different type of government, religion, maybe not real ethical, some of them, not all of them, some of them, but enough of them that I can't send my daughter down to the grocery store anymore without worrying about her being raped or accosted, or my wife can't go out in a miniskirt, or all of a sudden, things kind of changed. And it got bad enough that I decided, being somebody who maybe has some means, to move. Go somewhere where I could have the quality of life that I had. So, should I feel like something has been stolen from me because I didn't give that freely, I didn't agree to it? Is that the rule of law that has changed?
Well, I don't think it's changed in the sense that, you have the right to vote those people out in Washington if they do things you don't like. You have the right to move to another state, which is not actually, that's a lot of places you don't have that right. And so you still have the right to change your place of residence, change your job, hold your opinions. And rule of law is not perfect, and none of these systems are gonna satisfy everyone in a large nation of 320 million people. So there's always going to be someone someone who feels that their rights have not been. Now, I would say, for one thing, that all rights have to be limited to some extent. In this sense that if the scenario you're sketching out, if someone opens up the borders and everyone becomes an American, then no one has, essentially you disperse the rights to the point where there's no, there has to be a boundary between someone who has rights and someone who doesn't, okay? So you have to have some criteria by which you determine who's a citizen and who isn't, okay? And that's the political process that has to work itself out. Okay, because if you don't, I mean, like you say, if we say all these rights in the U.S. Constitution belong to everyone in the world, then no one can really realize them. Okay, so there has to be some restriction, but if you say, well, only certain people only people now living here get these rights, and people coming in don't, then there's another potential problem. You're going the opposite direction, and so. The Constitution is designed, and the Declaration were designed to try to balance all of these things out. So if you don't want these people coming in, but other people do, that's the political process by which we have to fight it out. And the laws don't say what the outcome is going to be. The laws say how you can, basically we're not going to kill each other over that issue. Only that we're going to try to get along and try to even agree to disagree over those issues. But it doesn't tell us what the outcome has got to be.
I thought that a republic was by the people, for the people, of the people, governing from the bottom up. And a democracy was making laws to govern from the top down. So I guess I'm confused. At what point do you become a democracy, and at what point do you retain your republic? And isn't that what Jefferson was famous for? Was in that saying, we've given you a republic, now it's up to you to be able to keep it, you must be vigilant.
Yeah, I think that was
Thank
Adam. I think that was
Franklin.
Franklin. It was
Yeah.
Franklin.
Franklin,
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, I mean, well, first of all, a democracy would be pure majoritarian rules. That would be, in theory, everyone from the bottom up. The republic is the people at the bottom get to choose the people at the top, who then set up the system or actually enforce the system of laws. But it's sort of up, down, and then so it's not bottom up and down. So it's not quite that straightforward. But the founders were very specific about not trying to determine what the outcome of the policy is going to be. So whether we have lots of immigration or not lots of immigration is not something that they would specify in these documents. That's the process that we have to work out amongst ourselves. And since I teach immigration, one of the things I'll tell you is that we can't decide, frankly, what our immigration policy ought to be. In Canada, they have a kind of a clear idea. We can't decide. We can't decide at this point what it means to be an American, who ought to be an American, who ought to not be American.
What's the difference between Canada and the United States?
Canada has a much more restrictive law in that it's based on economic necessity. So if you have job skills that are needed in Canada, they let in some refugees.
We have something similar.
We have something similar. We have many different types of systems, all trying to cohabit together. That's part of the problem. So we don't have a coherent. We don't have a. But I don't want to go into immigration policy because it's so complicated. But essentially that process is one that we have to decide. And if we can't decide, then it's not going to change until we. And part of the thing that when I mentioned about the virtue that they saw, that they had a common point of view. They were educated sort of on the same system, okay. And today we don't have that. We have when we talk about I hate to use the word diversity because it's so overused, but we have a nation of they had a much smaller country. And in fact, they were concerned about the country getting too large and being ungovernable. We now have 320 million people who are here, most of them citizens, but it's very hard to get a consensus on what values are, what it means to be an American, what are the values that constitute being an American. Those are the things that held us together. And one of the problems we're having is that we're not having that debate, or that debate is, going off into, kind of angry discussions.
And we talk about not having specific outcomes, that's what the courts are for too. I mean,
Right.
it's interpretation of law, it's not necessarily having a specific outcome, of course, but the
Right.
interpretation of
And
that
one-
law at various.
Yeah, and one of the
levels.
problems, and I, you know, when we say rule of law being important, but I would also say that the founders would not have believed that law was gonna solve our problems. Law would be law is like the last resort to solve our problems. We're supposed to resolve our problems amongst ourselves, and then we go to law.
Right.
And if it's only, because laws can be changed. You can have a law one day, and a lot of the terrible things that were done in authoritarian or dictators were done perfectly legally. When they went to kill Jews in Germany, that was perfectly legal. Okay, or kill the kulaks in the Soviet Union, that was all legal. Okay, because you can change the laws. You know, we had the law, you know, permitting slavery. That was perfectly legal, and yet, so depending on law to secure your rights is not something that the founders would have approved. It's the values that go behind the laws that they would have said is really going to be the ultimate guarantor.
We vote for our deciders who are then supposed to compromise
Yes, in theory.
on making these laws,
Of course,
right?
we tell them
And
not,
that's-
if we tell them not to compromise, they're not.
And that's the democracy and the republicanism coming together,
Yeah.
right?
You see
When
a
did
correl-
we become a country, and how did we become a country when landowners used to be, you had to be a landowner to be able to vote? When did the commoners take over? How did that?
That happened actually pretty quickly after the Articles of Confederation, and it went state by state. So some states went a lot quicker, like Massachusetts, some of the New England states allowed more and more people to vote more quickly. States like Virginia and North Carolina, it was a little bit slower process. That's one of the things that Andrew Jackson brings in when he becomes president, is he opens up the process, brings in a lot of people from the backcountry. This is why they didn't like him that much, bringing people from the backcountry and get them to vote. And before it was like, we don't want those people voting. So that process has gradually expanded. And in the early period, it was they were based on the states. The states were designed, that was a right of the state to decide who got to vote. And that was one of the problems that the civil rights movement had to address, because you had states in the South that said, well, if you know, and they'd play games with allowing black people to vote, keeping black people from voting, or immigrants or whoever, you know, Catholics, whatever, to vote, you know. And so that's why there's now, we have federal laws that regulate that.
I mean, we've generally become more democratic over time, of course,
Yeah.
through you know, through the right to vote and through also some of these other mechanisms.
More
like
more
primaries
people,
and
right?
things
More
like that.
more people have the right to vote.
Right.
More elements of society have the right to vote. You can still, like, if you're a felon in a lot of states, you can lose your right to vote. So there's ways. Just because you have the rights doesn't mean you always get to use them. But again, that's a process that, you know, is supposed to be run through the legal system. But it's a problem because we tend to rely on law now, and we have, you know, the number of lawyers to prove it. If you see you can actually track the number of lawyers over time, and that was considered a threat early on as well. But because we can't decide on what the underlying values are, and so that's why the courts have become, talk about this debate over the courts. This is why the courts are so important. The founders did not see the courts as being that important. They were important, but they weren't as important, like particularly the Supreme Court, and that's why we have these intensive battles over who's going to get on the Supreme Court, because now it matters much more, and that's an imbalance that the founders had not foreseen.
And it's one of the reasons why lawyers make so much money, because the demand is there too.
Exactly, yes.
Because it's
To
that influential, right?
specify everything, yes, to specify
One of the
everything in
reasons.
great detail.